So I don't know if you all recall, but a couple of weeks ago, Joyanne Reid went on the air and said that black Russian trolls were basically organizing a fake movement, called ADOS, which stands for African American Descendants of Slaves. This actually is not a fake black movement. It is very, very real. And I can assure you, they absolutely mean business. And if you are one of the campaigns not listening to this message, to the message from ADOS, then I suggest you start listening because they will be actively influence the outcome of this election. I promise you that. Now, Yvette Carnell is one of the creators of this movement. And of course, she immediately clapped back at Joyanne Reid, letting her know that she is real. This movement does have influence. And the entire next day, the people who are involved in the movement and the allies of that movement went full speed ahead at going at Joyanne Reid on Twitter. They shredded her, and she actually has never printed a retraction. She never went on air and apologized for calling people Russian trolls, despite the fact that people went outside of her office. Nor has she taken any heat or backlash from the mainstream media for asserting that black people are Russian trolls. Like I said, the first person who can find me someone who has collected in masse this political power as a black person and while being Russian, I will be extremely impressed, and I will just quit doing this show forever because it doesn't exist. Black people don't like the cold. I mean, what can I say? But in all seriousness, no one even critiqued her for it as far as the mainstream is concerned, which once again, the DNC, the Democratic Party, never critiqued her for it. And there's a reason for that. I'm going to get to it. They never critiqued her for it because they did, in fact, realize it was real. Now, here's what you have to be careful of when you're dealing in these type of politics. The people who start the conversations, the people who begin these discussions, who can use their political clout that they've developed and cultivated over the 2, 3, 4 years, sometimes 10 to 15 years at a time, rarely, if ever, do they get the credit for the movements that they initiate. In fact, it's actually the opposite. They get attacked. They get labeled domestic terrorists. If you need an example, the environmentalist movement. Kim Iverson was actually talking to me about that, and I completely forgot because it wasn't something it's not something I talk about often. But we're talking about climate change now, and it is the norm in how we are supposed to be treating the environment now, and it is the norm. However, just as early ago as the 90s, environmentalists were being put on domestic terrorism watch lists. But do you not think that they were the ones who started these conversations? Think about it like this. The FBI right now has a black identity extremist list for having conversations just like the one Yvette Carnell began. So, do you see a pattern for me? Because climate change now is in the mainstream. Now it's being discussed not only in the United States, but around the world. But that's only after they figure out a way at the most elite levels to make it profitable in whatever way that may be at the time. Now, what we're about to see, is another example of that. Because according to townhall.com, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren are all of a sudden for reparations for Black Americans. But I want to be very clear about that. There's not any legitimate effort for reparations by either of them. And you can't ever trust a politician who takes corporate money, which both of them do. You can never trust a politician who perpetuates and propagates the military-industrial complex, and both of them do. And you can never trust a politician who will go to a foreign country despite knowing that they are an active apartheid state and pandering to that country as if those are the ones who are oppressed, like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren do in regards to the Israel-Palestinian genocide, because that is what we're seeing. in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I just want to be very clear about that. But the conversation that they are trying to make reparations about, once again, are just as problematic because, like the environmentalist movement, it's not actually what we're asking for. They co-opt, it's like progressive movement, right? They co-opt the word that gives you the feeling, it gives you the appeal, like you're going to get what you have demanded. However, that's not actually the case. There has been plenty of organizations who've considered themselves progressive. I'm sure Tulsi Gabbard is familiar with one firm who considered themselves progressive that she had to fire because she realized, probably about as quickly as I did a couple of years ago, that they were never actually progressive. And we're going to see the same thing with this reparations rhetoric that's being perpetuated by Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. Now, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris support the idea of reparations for Black Americans who suffered from slavery, an idea that policy experts estimate could cost more than $14 trillion. Let's be honest, people. $14 trillion is actually probably underpaying if we're accounting for inflation over, I don't know, let's say 400 years. Yeah, 400 years. That's about how much you should be paying. And that's not even including pain and suffering, right? So when you get in an accident in a car, you get the damage from your medical, right? You get the damage from the car. You get the damage from the inconvenience, and then you get damages for pain and suffering because there's a lot of intangible circumstances that happen at times whenever you go through a traumatic experience. So, speaking on the radio program, The Breakfast Club, last week, Harris agreed that with one of the hosts who suggests reparations may be necessary to help redress the wrongs of slavery and racial discrimination. She goes on to say, I'm sorry, it's hard to read her words sometimes, but she goes on to say that we have to be honest, that people in this country do not start from the same place or have access to the same opportunities, and that's why I've chosen to make sure to put those people in jail at any opportunity that I get. And when I put those people in jail, you can rest assured that they will not get it. I'm just kidding. She didn't say the last part, but that sounds like something she would say because it is Kamala Harris. California's top cop. Anyway, she later told the New York Times when she was asked about it, I'm serious about taking an approach. If you were serious, then you would say what the approach was. But her approach would say, change policies and structures and make real investments in the Black community. That's not reparations. But they co-opt the word and then they dance around it. They don't say, oh, no, I didn't mean that. I meant this. So maybe Warren's a little bit better. We must confront the dark history of slavery and government-sanctioned discrimination in this country that has had many consequences, including undermining the ability of Black families to build wealth in America for generations, she told the Times. We need systemic structural changes to address that. Now, I may not be a policy expert. I may not be. I don't know if you all are, but I'm not. Maybe my reading comprehension skills are a little bit outdated. I haven't been back in college in a very long time, about 3 years. So maybe my reading comprehension skills need a little bit brushing up, a little touch up, a little eyeliner. I don't know. But did y'all hear anything about reparations in there? Oh, we can invest in the Black communities. Okay, pause. First of all, I want to be very clear about that. When we say Black community, we mean like a culture of community. There's pockets, by the way, of Black communities worth investing in. What do I mean by that? I mean that oftentimes the unfortunate truth of the matter is in places like the projects, like Marcy and Brooklyn, in places like Oakland, California, where there may be affordable housing, there may be government subsidized housing, but let's be very clear. I think Jay-Z said it best. Those aren't our communities. Those are the communities that you forced us in. Those are the communities where you made us dependent on your government subsidies and your government, I don't like call them entitlements, but essentially the everything that we had to rely on in order to get by at some point during our history is because of how much and how often you screwed us over. You act like Black people in the cities, the metropolitan areas, wanted to be on food stamps. No, they didn't. But remember, we used to be in the factories just as much as their white suburban counterparts, but then the suburbs were created. And when the suburbs were created, they ran those rails, those buses, all the subways through the Black communities with no stops. So if you didn't have a car, you didn't have a way to get to your factory job where that was enough to supply you and your entire family while your wife could stay at home. Back then, now the wife would be working, but I'm just saying back then, you could have 2-3 kids off that one factory salary in the city. But then we had to rely on government programs. Otherwise, because when you combine that with the active discrimination that was going on at the time, otherwise there would have been no hope of survival in a lot of ways. But then they'll try to claim, that Black people aren't self-determined. That's not true. I've given example after example. We can look at Tulsa, Oklahoma with Black Wall Street, government-sanctioned destruction. We can look at the Wilmington Massacre with some of the most prominent politicians in the country. One of the states that had the most representatives, North Carolina had the most representatives because, at the time, Black representatives, because of how successful they were politically in the Wilmington area. State sanctioned, once again, state sanctioned, government sanctioned destruction. Rosewood, Florida, Berkeley, California, Chicago, 1960. The list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Now, some people might want to make the argument, because I know they're going to be in here. They are. There's going to be some people that try to make the argument, why do we need to give reparations to Black people? Black people aren't the only ones that are poor. First of all, you going to come into this comment section with that nonsense, you better be very educated on it, because let me explain something to you. Well, let's just go over the raw numbers, right? According to the Institute for Policy Studies, white people it would take, 225 years. If every bit of inequality, and inequity ceased, halted right now, it would still take 225 years for us to catch up. Oh, by the way, right now, income inequality from Black people to almost every other race, specifically white people, but also the Asian American community as well, who was giving access to grants and loans that we were not given access to and that we were being denied for. It would take us 225 years to be even with them at our current pace. And that one, not at our current pace. That's if everything stood still. Now, some people say, well, they worked hard for their money. Yeah, no, you didn't. That's a lie. If I'm not mistaken, that was Donna Summers. Don't be. You're desecrating her name by saying they work hard for their money, because that is not necessarily the case, considering that 60% of all of that wealth was inherited. That's also according to the Institute for Policy Studies. So all that work hard, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps would make sense if Black people weren't being held back by about 200 years at that point. So when we finally got into the market, we were held back. Or when we finally got here, we couldn't earn anything. And we finally got into the market, y'all had a 220 plus year head start. So we're not going to go into Jim Crow yet. Let's just talk about that. Some of the most prominent companies that we know that are still around today, that still control our elections and therefore control the outcome of Black policy decisions, Black political decisions, and potential Black political outcomes, and all the implications that come with that. Some of those companies are still around today. The Rockefellers, the JP Morgan Chase, the Vanderbilts, Morgan Stanley, even. A lot of these companies have also changed their name, so I can't remember exactly which ones, but a lot of these companies were around during slavery. How much stock do you think we had in those companies? Yeah, I got to answer it. Zero. So already our ability to affect political outcomes to benefit our community like they affect political outcomes to benefit their communities was immediately hindered. So what do you want to talk about next? Jim Crow? Segregation? Do I have to elaborate on that? Right? And then we went through a period when we're finally catching up. Finally. Somewhat. Then redlining started. Redlining didn't officially end until roughly the 80s. Roughly. But Nixon didn't even want to enforce it. Reagan didn't want to enforce it either. So it still lingered around in the 90s and still affects some communities today. Hell, even today, if a black person goes to apply for a car loan, we automatically get higher interest. This is a fact. If we want to buy a house, unless you are a veteran, you will automatically get higher interest. That is a fact. At a point, we were getting metropolitan credit scores. And for those of you who don't know what redlining is, say if I wanted to buy a house in my community and I was black and that community was black because, segregation. So that's how black communities primarily got started. You can't get the loan. But you can rent though, and you can rent and rent and rent and rent and rent and rent and rent. 40, 50, 60 years later, you don't own a damn thing. What if I want to take a second mortgage on my house that I already bought before redlining started? Because that's how a lot of people start businesses. A lot of people don't know that. That's how a lot of people, you take out a second mortgage on your house, you get that loan, and you invest that into your business. And then you grow your wealth and pay back your loan for the house and the loan for the business simultaneously at, by the way, a much lower rate of interest because you've already proven that you've built up credit by paying off your house religiously and faithfully over however long you've owned it. We couldn't do that. In our neighborhoods, we weren't even allowed to take out business loans. But the Arab community, the Desi community, and the East Asian community was allowed to do that. So they own the liquor stores, the convenience stores, and all these other stores in our communities. The community was not ours. So fast forward to 2019. Some communities had a 100-year head start. Some communities had about 150. And then there is the sect that controls society as we know it and affects a lot of the political outcomes for black people. They've had a 400-year head start. Do you understand what? So now every decision that trickles down from there is affected by the wealth we never, ever, ever had an opportunity to accrue. You know what a Harvard study said? Because it's also intangible. Like there's the tangible, the numbers, but then there's the intangibles that also oftentimes don't get accounted for. Like, yeah, there was legal segregation, but then it got desegregated, but then you have to deal with all the implications and the psychosis behind making it the norm for segregation to exist. Now, what do I mean by that? In order to convince people that black people should be on that side of the room, not drink from this water fountain, but have to drink from that water fountain, to use a different bathroom as you, to be in a different classroom as you have to convince them that inherently black people are less than human. They are not equal to you, and therefore they should not exist in the same place as you at the same time. They are disgusting. They dehumanize us. They devalued us. And with that, the value of that humanity and our humanity, there is a real connection to the devaluing of our worth as a dollar. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, there was a Harvard study that was done where they asked CEOs, were they likely to hire black people or likely to hire white people? And it was different circumstances that were given. Now, there was one that discussed drug use. A lot of CEOs, that almost all of them actually, unfortunately, they said that they will not be as likely to hire a black person because they are more likely to use drugs than their white counterparts. This isn't me. This is a Harvard study with the CEOs saying this, and they were saying this shamelessly, by the way. So that means there are people who are not hired because there are there are CEOs, probably white, who were preconditioned to believe that black people do drugs. When the statistics came back in that exact same Harvard study, guess what it showed? You're damn right. The white people were actually, the white applicants, the white employees were actually more likely to do drugs than their black counterparts. But once again, when you were conditioned to believe something for so long about black people, that we're just degenerates and hooligans, you believe it. But let's be very clear about something. I live in Miami, Florida, right down the street from Boca Raton, the rehab capital of the world. All those halfway houses, all those rehab centers, is a business up there. I've seen one black person in a business that houses and rehabs hundreds of thousands of people a year, of white drug addicts who've been fired and are trying to get back their job, who've been kicked out of their family and stolen from their family. All these stereotypes that they try to assign to us. I'm not saying that that's obvious. I'm not saying that's a white thing, but what I'm saying is, if I was raised in Boca, and if you were like a white person who's never been around black people, never knew anything about black people, and you were raised in Boca, you would be conditioned to believe white people are drug addicts, because that's all you've ever seen living down here. But also the way we're treated, of course, is different, which also fast forwards to my next point. They get rehab centers, they get second chances. You know, when the pill crisis happens, it's an epidemic. It's a medical problem. When the crack era started and marijuana became more popular, and the crack was put into communities by our intelligence agencies, black people were thrown immediately in jail. 3-strike law, all the stuff that disproportionately affected black people. Black people occupy 93%. Oh, I think it's 91%. So we occupy 91% of all prisons around the nation as we speak. And yet we are only 13% of the population. We are on average going to get lesser or higher sentences. We are on average going to be more likely to get the death penalty. And a lot of the times they will get the case wrong. Yeah, that happens. So overall, reparations are not only possible, but they are necessary. And yeah, maybe some of it can be real estate. But there needs to be dollar signs, direct deposits, money involved. Because the investments that you were able to make, the savings that you were able to make, because of the inheritance that you may have or may not have gotten, or the jobs that you were able to get, that we were not able to get. The families that you were able to keep together, despite the mistakes that your family may or may not have made, compared to the families that we weren't able to keep together, despite the, mistakes that some may or may not have made. The difference was, a lot of the times black people had to sell drugs in order to keep their family afloat, because they were being denied jobs, because they had no transportation, because they were cut off from suburban society. Marijuana, right now, people are making millions and millions of dollars off of it. But black people were punished. And then we come to find out later on that Bill Clinton was corrupt, paying off the DEA and the ATF to go after black people because he was taking money from the private prison industry. So then people became financially incentivized to take advantage of the inherent racism they know our society practices. And the list really does go on. And with everything, so redlining, right? Redlining just ended. And it didn't even end. It's mostly over, mostly. Gentrification is the last step. If we would have been able to accrue the equal amount of wealth starting at 400 years ago, hell, even half of that, we finally start to get some opportunities to finally start building up some of our communities, building up small businesses, building up our middle class. How did that work out for us? Because of the wealth all these super millionaires and billionaires accrued, They had the ability to do once again what has always happened to us. It just took a different form. They were able to gentrify us. So there's a lot of ways you get gentrified. Our hip hop got gentrified too, but our clothing style got gentrified. But we built up our communities finally. We made it our own. We built up our neighborhoods. We made them something that you could take pride in. And they were like, wow, that looks really nice. The whole reason that Black people lived here was because we didn't have transportation. You know, it's historically we didn't have transportation. We didn't have the means of travel. You had multiple kids. Had to be as effective and efficient as humanly possible because of that. And that makes you a prime real estate location. The only reason that you weren't, it wasn't before, was because there were poor minorities living there. Now, you've built it up to something beautiful. We got to buy that off you, homie. We need that. To the point where there's nothing you can do about it. So in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, parts of Queens, the people where the people of color live in New Jersey, you see it in Philadelphia, you see it in Miami, you see it in Oakland, you see it in San Francisco, horribly. South LA, like it's we were comfortable finally. To some of us, we're comfortable finally. But we weren't mega millionaires like the people who had hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth that they accrued through inheritance, through CEO positions, through expansions, through investments, all these things that we had been denied access to, and then we couldn't afford access to. And then by the time we could finally afford to do something, that it was taken away from us. That is what reparations are about. Now, some people would ask a simple question, in my opinion. How do we know who was a Black slave? It doesn't matter. Are you Black? Were you here? Were you here long enough to feel the ramifications of what started with bodies who were stolen from one place and brought here and purposely held down? So, like I said, redlining, one of the final pieces of final legal pieces of systemic racism, ended around the 90s. Officially the 80s, but really around the 90s. So all you have to do is give annual or monthly stipends to Black families who can prove their American lineage 3 generations back. That's simple. Because they felt the same. It could have, maybe a little bit, if you're 5, 6, 7, 8 generations back, maybe you deserve a little bit more. But that also gives you a little bit more time to build and counteract that. Like, for example, I'm 3rd generation. Am I 3rd generation? I think I'm 3rd generation Islander. Third generation or 4th. I can't remember. 3rd or 4th. Because my family fell victim to the diaspora, also a part of slavery and also a part of Great Britain and America basically going to town on the islands. I don't know. There is no such thing as a family reunion for us. We're all split. We're all over the country. Half of us don't even know the other half exists because we were all just trying to survive. That happened. So I don't have my mom is now secure, but my family historically has never had, well, let me go to grandma for money. Let me go to grandpa for money. Let me tap into my Roth IRA account. Let me tap into my 401k. We've never had that. And most of the families around this country don't have it. So that's just one example. 3 generations, the end of redlining. That's where it should start. It's not difficult because even though you may not be able to say, oh, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave, you can say that you've been affected by all of it. Because what also, on another note, people do not know, there was another study that was done that Ptsd can be passed down through DNA. Just like how autism can be inherited PTSD is also a mental mutation. That's why you react the way you do. That was also passed down. So the trauma of slavery, the trauma of Jim Crow, the trauma of all these things are still affecting Black people today. Constant state of anxiety. There's a mental disorder epidemic in the Black community. And a lot of us can't even, I am fortunate enough to have TRICARE, but a lot of Black people can't even afford to deal with it because it's a stigma. Mental illness is a stigma in our community because we couldn't afford to deal with our problems for so long, we had to learn to tough it out and be strong. Black mothers, especially. But let's be very clear. The time has come. ADOS is real, and politicians are going to have to deal with it. And I think it's about time that they do. This is not a divisive issue. We give billions and billions and billions to Israel because of the Holocaust every single year. The Holocaust that we didn't even take part in. But if we can send that money overseas every single year, and I don't even want to tell y'all the reparations they get because it's more than just giving a little bit of money. It's more than that. I don't want to tell you what they get because you're going to get pissed. But I can tell you this. If we can spend billions there, we can spend billions right here at home to take care of only 13% of the United States population. It's that easy. Thanks for watching that segment of Mi Casa es Su Casa. You can donate to our Patreon and keep helping the network grow by clicking on the link in the description below. And also, make sure you join us at JustNForm.com. And finally, make sure you subscribe to us on Roku and be part of the very first independent news network on Roku TV. But more than anything else, always remember, find your balance. Peace.